You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Today is our historic first for our program. We've never interviewed Rabbi Efrem Goldberg, the senior rabbi of the Boca Raton Synagogue in Florida, New York. It's a growing shul, over 850 members. The first time he's appearing on the program. He's also one of the leading rabbis in the United States. He plays a role in not just in the Florida area, but he's involved in national organizations, including the Rabbinical Council of America, the Beth-Din of America, Tradition Magazine, APAC. He has a very popular podcast, which gets all kinds of prominent individuals, including the Prime Minister of Israel. Rabbi Efrem Goldberg, thank you for joining us.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. You've written some fascinating articles I want to talk about and pick your brain, because what I like is you're not afraid to speak out. Not always are rabbis. A lot of rabbis are reticent to really speak out their position. They'll do it in shul, but when you call them to be public about it, all of a sudden they're reticent. So first, I want to start with the abortion issue, the Roe v. Wade. That's the big issue, and people look at the Jewish community, look at Orthodox Judaism, and say, "Well, Orthodox Judaism has one position when it comes to abortion." It's not true, and you've written about it. But let's talk about the Jewish position regarding abortion.
Absolutely. Every time someone compliments me for having the courage to speak out, I'm not sure if it's courage or foolishness. It's a fine line between the two. But to me, I think it's true and authentic. And I think if we speak respectfully and sensitively and try our best to represent what God wants on His Torah, that's our responsibility. And abortion is a perfect case study. We're living in a time where we are increasingly more partisan, increasingly divided, increasingly politicized, and our rabbis warned us not to use Torah as a kardom lachborba. They said, don't take Torah, don't take Judaism, and don't turn it into a weapon, an instrument. Don't use it as a means to battle or fight with others for other reasons or causes. Stay true to Torah and what it represents. So immediately when that leak came out, the leak itself is in gross violation of Torah, egregious violation of morals and ethics, whomever leaked the consideration of the Supreme Court. But when the leak came out, you saw social media light up. And half of them said, Judaism is absolutely pro-choice. And the other half said, Judaism is absolutely pro-life. And the answer is that Judaism doesn't conveniently fit into either of those two. It's nuanced, and it's complex, and it's challenging. And a person has to immerse themselves in the study to understand the details and understand the minutiae and the sources, and to understand that there are different opinions. And we have a rich tradition of disagreement. So when you represent Judaism is this or is that, you're actually oversimplifying Judaism. Torah and Judaism don't fit in 140 characters on Twitter. They take a lot more than that. And we do a terrible, terrible disservice to advance whatever political agenda to oversimplify or misrepresent or distort where Torah or Judaism is on something. And I think our mission, in addition to the topic itself, and we could talk about abortion, but the meta topic, even before you get into abortion per se, is that we should be advocating and we should be examples of nuance. That things are complex and they're complicated. They're not black and white, there's gray. We value life. We believe abortion is prohibited. The default is that abortion is wrong. It's not a woman's right. It's not anyone's right to choose. It's not a function of your body. It's a moral decision. It's part of the definition of when life begins. It falls under a legal system and legal analysis. Certainly, we feel strongly in a pro-life context that we value life and advocate for life and fight for life, and we protect the most vulnerable for their lives. However, within that, it's nuanced. It's nuanced. So, for example, Rav Moshe Feinstein famously believed that abortion was murder, and therefore only permissible when saving the life of the mother, only permissible in self-defense. If the baby is compromising the life of the mother, the viability of the mother, then you can abort the baby. But there are many other opinions. And in fact, I personally, as a rabbi, have on several occasions had to be involved in abortion issues or questions. Of course, never deciding on my own. My shoulders are not nearly broad enough, but turning to great rabbis of our generation. And really, it's the opinion of the Tzitz Eliezer of Oldenburg, who was more permissive and liberal on abortion, which I think many, I won't say most, contemporary halachic authorities follow in cases of rape and incest, in cases of diseases that will give a very short life, psychiatric illness, where the well-being of the mother may be threatened, in cases of abduction. There are many, many examples today where Moshe is not the mainstream. And my point is not to suggest that Moshe is not an opinion. He doesn't need to say, or those who follow it. My point is, it's complex, and when we simplify, we do a disservice. So we can politically land where we may, but if we represent Torah and Judaism, we must begin by saying that we don't neatly into either the camps, but rather we have something in between. Certainly stand for life. Abortion, the default is prohibited. We don't take it. We advocate for vulnerable. However, the carve-outs we mentioned, particularly the life of the mother, which even Rav Moshe agrees, but many other carve-outs as well.
I believe also if the mental health of the mother is at stake, I believe that Tzitz Ezra says if the mother's mental health is affected, there also an abortion could be allowed.
I recently had a case, Zev, that a woman with a strong psychiatric condition who had a history of depression and who the concern, she was not supposed to get pregnant again. The concern was with the pregnancy and anxiety escalating, she could have suicidal ideation. She was at risk of suicide. And I called a major posek who told me, the major posek said to me, Efrem, it's not that it's permissible, she's obligated to have an abortion. If this pregnancy carries forward and it could cost her own life because of her psychiatric vulnerability, she could take her own life. She's not only permissible, she's obligated to have an abortion.
Which is pretty strong language. But really, there are a few different issues that are at play, and you're right about it. Number one is that the problem is that people want abortion on demand as opposed to looking at different circumstances, which is what you delineated. The other issue is at what stage are we talking about? A few weeks, a few months? I believe some states want to have it where you can abort the baby up until birth. So these are all varying degrees, and this also has an impact on our discussion about abortion.
Absolutely, enormously. We have demarcations before 40 days and after 40 days. Before 40 days, the Talmud calls Maya Ba'alma, embryonic fluid. That's not to minimize somebody who's pregnant less than 40 days, but it means halachically the status of a pregnancy less than 40 days is not a full-fledged pregnancy with many, many consequences, including a miscarriage. Would the next child be a pidyon haben? There are many consequences of it. So 40 days is a very significant delineation. If a woman were raped and she was able to, within 72 hours, even prevent the pregnancy from taking root, let alone aborting a viable pregnancy, many more poskim would be permissive. So when you can calculate, Tay-Sachs, for example, can be diagnosed within 40 days. So that 40-day delineation is a significant one. Others see 3 months, 7 months. The Tzitz Eliezer is willing to go later into pregnancy. Others only earlier into pregnancy. But that's why this area and issue is so complex and complicated. And there's such divergent opinions among our giants, whom we accept them all and recognize elu ve'elu, that there can be multiple truths. There's a system we have to follow. It's a hierarchy we have to have a fidelity to, but there are multiple truths. That's why it's an injustice and a disservice to simplify it, certainly to do so in the name of advancing a political agenda.
But in general, I would say, and I don't want to label, but I will, is the left tends to portray Orthodox Jews as being barbaric, backwards, not with the times. So this fits the narrative, not just in the case of abortion, but other areas say, well, Orthodox Jews, well, they have a different perspective. And some Jews believe the same thing too. They don't know about our heritage. But how do we communicate this message, which what you have, it's very, very much a message that, it's nuanced.
Yeah, it is a nuanced message, and it's a message about nuance. In this partisan world where you're either with me or against me,
There's no in between. There's no in between. There's no derech hazav. The middle way doesn't exist.
Correct. I'll give you an example, actually, at the risk of upsetting some of your listeners, because of
we're not afraid of controversy here.
How difficult it is for people to understand this. It goes back to the last administration. For some reason, there were people who were simply incapable of those, including me, to be able to simultaneously say the Trump administration did unprecedentedly great things for Israel and for the Jewish people, while I wholesale reject so much of his character or his behavior or other aspects of what the administration did. A nuanced view that says, I can recognize the good, be grateful for it, embrace it, wish there was more of it, while simultaneously reject and be disappointed in other aspects of an administration or who a person was. Right? The last administration was a perfect example of a world of with or against. You get it or you don't get it. You're either never Trump or always Trump. You had people who thought he was perfect. You had people who thought you're not allowed to criticize. How dare you? And you had others who said his imperfections are so great. How dare you acknowledge anything good? How dare you be grateful for anything that was done? There's nuanced views. Life does not conveniently, neatly fit into boxes. And I think, again, Torah is a great platform of nuance, and part of the charge and the mandate to the Jewish people is not to fall into the trap of what's happening all around us in Washington and everywhere else, where everything is for or against, everything is partisan, everything is divided, everything is you're on a different team. I love unpredictable people who come to a conclusion about this way, that way. They're not predictable. Most people today, you could ask them 3 questions, you know everything about what they believe on anything. Or you could just look at how they're voted, how they're registered to vote, and you know almost everything about what they believe. We weren't designed to be that way. The world is complex. We're complex. Torah is complex. It's nuanced, and we should stand for, represent, advocate, model that nuance in this world.
But by the way, you mentioned Donald Trump, and we'll get political for a moment. I believe in the last election, if I remember the numbers, it's approximately about 90% of the Orthodox Jewish community supported and vote for Donald Trump. He's almost a Mashiach. He talked about him today. So your nuanced perspective is not the mainstream of the majority of Orthodox Jews.
The nuance, it's a very lonely place. I'll be honest. Over that last administration, I felt like I was in a very lonely place, vilified by both sides, including as a rabbi. If you didn't, by those who were forever Trump and thought that he was, literally the Messiah of the Jewish people. If you said anything critical, if you alluded or hinted, if you were critical of things that deserve to be criticized and that we Torah personalities should recoil from, then you were vilified. How dare you not appreciate all the good he's done? And on the other end, if you said, there were some remarkable contributions, some incredible breakthrough, some things that we truly should be grateful for that no one before him and we don't know if after him anyone will do, then you were vilified by the other side. How dare you, if a Torah character, be willing to say anything positive?
So, but that's not limited to the Trump administration. I believe you met with President Barack Obama, and he was not liked, and I'm putting it mildly, in the Orthodox Jewish community, but he did do some good. The Iron Dome, and I said this publicly, he has to be thanked for his support of the Iron Dome. People didn't like that either. So we live in times very partisan. People don't want to look, and they say everybody's completely evil, completely good. They don't look at Banner. They don't look at everybody in between.
It's a dangerous world we're living in so many ways. The world is increasingly becoming unrecognizable every day, from our basic definitions and identities and interactions and policies. It's increasingly unrecognizable. And our job, I think that Hashem, without being too dramatic, I really believe that God is telling we, his children, hey, stand up and speak for truth with nuance, with sensitivity, and with love, but defend the principles through which I created this world before we find ourselves in a generation of the flood, before we find ourselves in a generation of Egypt. We're becoming so morally corrupt and bankrupt that with all the progress we've made technologically in medicine and in so many other areas, we've regressed so far back morally. And I think it's up to us to not fall prey to some of the definitions or fears or canceling or political correction of the time, with sensitivity, with love, with nuance, with respect, but also with firmness, represent and stand up for Hashem and talk about how we believe he wants us to behave and how we should defend his world. So today, the world we're living in, I was talking recently to a congressman, and he said to me, he's a phenomenal congressman, Richie Torres from the Bronx. And
we had him on. He's a liberal, progressive candidate who's a very big supporter of Israel.
Exactly. He's a phenomenal person. And he said, we're living in a world where you're rewarded for the wrong behavior and you're punished for the right behavior. If you make headlines by calling the other person names, by cursing, by saying radical, outrageous things, you'll pick up another 1 million followers online. You'll raise another $1 million. You'll win another term, and you are rewarded for your being outrageous. You're rewarded for being adversarial. And on the other end, if you say, hey, let's work across the aisle, we have a lot in common, the things that we can get done. Let's speak respectfully to and about one another. You'll have no followers, you'll raise no money, and somebody will rise and knock you out of office. So we're living in a world that you're noticed, and you're rewarded for the wrong behavior, and you're invisible, and you are eliminated for the right behavior. And it's up to us to change. And you see that, by the way, even among Jewish personalities. The ones who have the biggest followings online or make the most noise often are the ones who say the most outrageous things. They're the ones who get the attention, and they get the followers and so on. They get the airtime. And the ones who are saying the right things, well, nobody wants to hear that. That doesn't make a headline, So it's a challenging time, but we need to model for ourselves and most importantly for our children the way that we're meant to be behaving.
Our guest is not afraid to speak out. Rabbi Efrem Goldberg is a senior rabbi of the Boca Raton Synagogue, a rapidly growing shul of over 850 families in Florida. He's also well sought after speaker, lecturer, one of the top rabbis in the United States, involved in many different Jewish organizations. We're talking about consensus. We tend to either go right or left. There's no middle. I believe you got criticized when you came out supporting the rabbi who was held hostage in Texas. People sent you all kinds of things about what the rabbi does and his viewpoints, and you basically said that your concern for him is regardless of whatever his viewpoints are for just being a Jew. It wasn't very popular with some people out there, correct?
Correct. That rabbi, while he was held hostage, universally, we were all praying for him. But what happened was, soon after his heroic release, he threw that chair, they got out. People, as is wont to do today, dig up whatever they could find online that he had ever posted or written or whatever his beliefs were. And they found politically he was outside the pale of what they want. Now, first of all, even while he was held hostage, his own theological religious beliefs are outside of the pale of what I believe. But what does that have to do with anything? If I had a son or a daughter, a brother or sister, whose life was threatened or held hostage, would I pause to say, what kind of yarmulke do they wear? Where do they send their kids to school? Do they open cans on Shabbos? Or do they end at Rabbeinu Tam? Like, would you stop to ask those questions? Or would you say, a fellow Jew's life is threatened? Our job is to stop and pray for them. So I actually found it deeply disturbing and offensive how quickly we pivoted from caring about a fellow Jew to then we discovered that that fellow Jew politically on Israel is different than us. So debate rigorously. Take him on rigorously. Debate with him rigorously. Advocate incredibly strongly for what you believe. Of course, I'm all for that. But in terms of our care and our concern for a fellow Jew, Rav Levin, would he not have davened for him? When Rav Levin went to the jails, did he first check everyone's tzitzis? Did he first check their yarmulke? Did he want to know where they are in a two-state solution? There was no two-state solution then. But I'm just saying, our greatest heroes, the biggest tzaddikim of our time in the past time, they saw the heart of a Jew. They prayed for a Jew. You'll get back later to debating. Plenty of time and plenty of room to debate. Call that rabbi from Texas and have a debate about peace in Israel. But while he's held hostage and right afterwards, should have only concern and care.
You mentioned, it's funny. You were thinking about, as you mentioned, Rabbi Aryeh Levin. I was thinking about him as you were talking because he loved everybody. He came from a Haredi background. He was the rabbi to the Irgun, to the Stern prisoners in British prisons. He loved them all. In fact, when they saw him, even if they were religious and it was on Shabbos, if they were smoking a cigarette, they put it in their mouth so he shouldn't be seen by them by smoking on Shabbos. There's even stories of holding the hand of murderers. And really, he reached out, and he's an example. And I recommend the book, Tzaddik in Our Times. And I'm glad you mentioned him because that's how we should be, is not be judgmental. We always look to find the fault in somebody. We should be looking to find the positive in somebody.
Exactly. I'll tell you my favorite Rav Levin story, Zev, is he was walking through Nachlaot, the little neighborhood in which he lived, and there was a boy who grew up in the neighborhood who had been avoiding him. He was weaving in and out of alleys. Every time Rav Levin walked his way, he would disappear around the corner. And finally, he couldn't help it. Once by accident, Rav Levin ran right into him. So he said to the young man, he said, I haven't seen you in so long. Where have you been? So the young man, sheepishly, he was shy. He was ashamed. He said to the tzaddik, he said, a few months ago, I became less religious and I stopped wearing a yarmulke. And I was so afraid to run into you. I didn't want to disappoint you. I didn't want to upset you. I've been avoiding you. So Rav Levin looked at the man and he said, the young boy, and he said, I'm a very short man. I can't see what's on your head. All I can see is what's in your heart. And that's how he lived his life. I can't see what's on your head. All I see is what's in your heart. Now, again, and this is what I wrote about maybe a month ago, also is the nuance position. And it's a very, very fine line to try to weave. How can we, on the one hand, say, we know what a man is, we know what a woman is, we know what marriage is. We have these definitions. They're as basic to us as is that the world is round. And nobody can tell us differently. This is the way God created the world, the definitions he gave us. Zachar and Nekeva Bra'am, he built into the fabric of creation the distinction between male and female, masculinity, femininity, basic biology. But at the same time, we also acknowledge and recognize that not everyone feels that they fit neatly into those definitions. So how can we maintain and preserve our definitions and our policies, and at the same time show sensitivity and welcoming and to confront bullying of those who don't fit in? That takes nuance. So you have segments of the frum community who say, this is what we believe, everything outside of that is disgusting, and it's a toeva, and it's an abomination, and there's no room, and drive them away. And you have others who wholesale say, this is the civil rights issue of our time. So therefore we believe, and we'll even officiate those weddings, and we make room, and we will reinterpret Torah. And what I'm advocating for is that nuanced position, to try to weave that fine line. It's very, very difficult. That says, this is our truth. It's immutable. It's not debatable. This is what we believe. But the fact that we believe it does not mean that therefore we're a group of bullies. It doesn't mean that we're insensitive or callous. We care about and we make space for the people who believe differently, even while we are uncompromising in what we believe. That's a very nuanced and a very difficult. But I think that the stakes are very high to do that and to do it now, because I don't think it's a long time. And in some communities, it's already happening now. I believe that it's not a long time from now in which we're going to have sensitivity training in Jewish day schools that talk about pronouns and allowing children to choose their pronouns. And I don't think if we don't stop this now, and if we don't stand up for what we believe now, and again, while also developing curriculum against bullying, and while also making room with sensitivity to those who are different, but without being defensive and without being apologetic, standing up for what we believe. This slope is so slippery and it's moving so fast that if we don't act now, we could have a lot of regrets later.
I want to get to that. Do you remind me of the Sridei Eish, who had a relationship and a friendship, a deep friendship with, I believe, a professor at the Hebrew Union College, and Rabbi At, who was criticized for having that relationship, and he says, "Yes, I know the Torah says somebody who's anti-Torah, I'm supposed to hate them, but I can't hate a fellow Jew." And I think that's what we're talking about over here. But how do we deal, Rabbi Efrem Goldberg? How do we deal with gender sensitivity issues? He, she, they, all the pronouns. How do we deal with gays, with those that lesbians in the Orthodox place? Because on the one hand, it's prohibited by the Torah, but they belong to Orthodox shuls. A lot of them are speaking out. How should we deal with it?
It's a big question. It's a big question.
Transgender, of course, too.
Right. It's a big question, probably bigger for the time that we have now. But we need to deal with it thoughtfully, and we need to deal with it sensitively, and we need to deal with it in a principled way without watering down or compromising what we believe in. So I think, to me, those are the principles that drive us, that we have to have our truth and be uncompromising in it. But one of the truths that we have is sensitivity. So, for example, the Torah says that that gay relations, gay intercourse is clearly biblically prohibited. It's called a to'eva, an abomination, but so are dishonest weights and scales. So are dishonest measures. The people who don't pay their taxes are violating the very same word of abomination, a to'eva, as those who experience these interpersonal relations. So the interpersonal relationship, we cannot be matir asurim. We cannot permit that which is forbidden. The Torah doesn't recognize a marriage other than between a husband and a wife, a man and a woman. The Torah does not allow the union, the physical union of two men. And two women is more complicated within halacha, but also the Torah does not allow outright for that as well.
I'll give you an example that happened to me, and I'm involved with different shuls. I don't want to mention the name of the shul, but there was somebody who was davening for the Yom. When I walked in, they said, "Take him off." You know, he was at the Israeli Day Parade wearing a gay pride button. He's gay. You can't have him davening for the Yom. I said, first of all, I don't know who the person is. Never saw me. I'm not taking him off. I'm not going to embarrass somebody in the middle of the shul. But there was a whole scene about it. So these are things which, and I understand where people are coming from, but to embarrass people is not the Jewish way, but we're seeing more of that reactionary reactions in lots of different places. I just gave one small example of that.
Yeah, you did. The advocacy is so strong that's what I think is creating, for each action, there's a reaction. So the advocacy by the gay community, the transgender community, LGBTQ, these communities, their advocacy is so strong and so in everyone's face, so to say, that it's garnered an equal reaction in the opposite direction. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's the way we are meant to react. So again, is there nuance? Is there room in the middle that says that if somebody doesn't wear it on their sleeve, is not challenging you, they're not wearing their rainbow color gay advocacy shirt in shul, right?
Mm-hmm.
In shul, they're there as an Eved Hashem trying to daven. So is there room that says, while we cannot permit things that the Torah says are forbidden, while we as a shul could never give a family membership to two men or two women, we couldn't recognize a family membership where Judaism doesn't endorse a familial connection, but we still can make room and space.
But what do you do like in a school where you have two lesbians or two gay men have a child in a yeshiva and you send out a note? Do you call parent and parent? Do you call Mr. and Mr.? How do you deal with it? These are issues which are coming more prevalent in some of the modern Orthodox schools.
They're becoming more prevalent every day. Each one has to deal with it with their own process, their own rabbis, their own lay leaders, their own policies. But I think that what the tools that we have to use to navigate this question is we have to stay true to the Torah. So you cannot call you cannot call a gay couple a family. They're not a husband and a husband. That's the Torah doesn't recognize that. On the other hand, do you punish a child who's been adopted or the product who's Jewish and who wants a Jewish education and a Jewish future? Do we deny or deprive that to that child? So how do we carefully navigate? Now, what I'll say, and again, this is a topic much bigger and broader.
We have to have you
but
back
right
to
now,
discuss more in depth. And
yeah, but I'll just say this. I think that both sides are going to need to be willing to play ball, meaning the gay couple or LGBT or whatever the transgender. And in our shul, we had a case of a man who wore a gartel and a black hat and underwent surgery to become a woman. And I was guided by Gedolei Yisrael. I would never make these decisions on my own. During that time period, what we do and which side of a machitza and what kind of a membership and how we function. And there were interesting answers to all those questions, but both sides have to come in with the spirit of a willing to work it out. If either one is going to come in as an advocate, if either one is coming in as virulent, if either one is coming in as overly vocal, it's not going to be able to find that nuance, that space, that gray, where we can stay true to our principles and our values, unapologetic for what the Torah and Halacha say, and yet make space because we love you. If somebody's going to get up and scream, how dare you not accept my family membership as a husband and a husband, my gay marriage, then if you're going to challenge us in that way.
Do you wish them mazel if they had, let's say, that boy who is either the gay or lesbian couple has a bar mitzvah? Do you acknowledge the two individuals that have this child? Do you wish them mazel tov from the pulpit?
I've not been put in that position yet. I say yet because likely we all will at some point. But yeah, how do you navigate that? How do you wish a mazel tov to the boy? And how do you acknowledge these two men in his life who nurture and love and care and are devoted without acknowledging that they are married? How do you acknowledge these two men are in his life?
How do you do that if that ever comes up? Or how do you deal with it?
I think there'll be a lot of wordsmithing that will have to happen. We have had to deal with, and I think every rabbi has or will, what happens when a member of the shul has a child who has the same gender marriage? Do you wish a mazel tov in the announcements for that? What happens? This is not nearly the same. It's a lot less complicated. What happens when a single woman undergoes IVF to have a child? You wish her a mazel tov on the birth of her child outside the context of a marriage because she's undergone IVF. Again, much less controversial, much less halachically complicated, but also not normative in the world in which
what I find intriguing, though, if you have a situation where you have a couple who have a child and the child intermarries, you wouldn't even think to wish mazel tov from the pulpit.
Right.
But yet, if the same gender or same sex marriage takes place, they expect it. It's just an interesting way of how people have different expectations.
And with younger, it's even stronger. Go into almost any modern Orthodox, and I would argue, by the way, it's not just modern Orthodox. I would argue you can go into certainly out of town, more yeshivish places, and you ask these young people, if you have a good friend who's having a same-sex marriage and invites you, would you go? And you will be shocked by the high percentage who say, look, I don't believe in it, it's against the Torah, but I'm happy for them and I want them to be happy. And yes, I would go, or I would acknowledge it, or I would send a gift, or I would have them over. And then you say to them, but would you go if your friend intermarries? Would you attend that wedding? And they'll all say no. And then you say, well, what's the difference? Why would you not go to a close friend's intermarriage wedding, but you would go to a close friend's same gender marriage wedding? And they struggle to come up with an answer. I think it's partially that the world has positioned the same gender marriage as the civil rights issue of our time. And therefore it's discriminatory not to, and I don't want to be part of that. I just want them to be happy no matter my beliefs.
I think Moshe Feinstein was asked a question by somebody whose child was intermarried, and he asked Moshe, should he sit shiva for the child? And Moshe said no, because if he's sitting shiva, it means he's dead. The dead don't come back. But if you don't, it's a chance, they'll come back. A few moments left, Rabbi. We're looking at some very important issues. Rabbi Efrem Goldberg is not afraid to speak out. The senior rabbi of the Boca Raton Synagogue, a well-sought-out speaker across the United States, involved in so many different Jewish organizations. And one of the issues that you got yourself in trouble with, Rabbi Goldberg, was an event that took place in January of 2022, which had the United States Ambassador David Friedman, and you had Ben Shapiro. You also had Latino Coalition for Israel President, Pastor Mario Bromnick, and people were attacking you for saying, how can you have a missionary in your shul? It was a very pro-Israel event, and we do believe in reaching out to the evangelical Christian community, but you got a lot of flack for that. So tell us what that was all about. And they said Rav Herschel Schechter was opposed to you. They forged a letter, right? They're saying that he didn't allow you to do it. All fakery. But what's going on? The people go to such lengths, they'll spread lies and misinformation and print things which are not true and fabricate documents. Is this the Torah way of doing things? I was shocked when I saw that.
It was shocking. Zev, I had a full head of dark hair before that event. That's not true. But, unfortunately, very few things shock me anymore. And this is a consequence of trying to do the right thing. There are things I've learned or would do differently, not that I regret or think that we did anything wrong. But we did this night for Israel. Israel, look at the wave of terror that's going through Israel now. Israel is constantly under threat from our outside and from inside. And what I found fascinating was the people who are throwing arrows at me, the people who were the most critical and willing to violate every line of ethics, forging a letter from Rav Sheffer.
Halacha, there was violation. How can you attack a Jew with lies, distortions,
Correct.
without benefit of a doubt, without speaking to you? I was just appalled when I saw that.
Correct. And death threats to me, to my family, to the entire shul. You know that we received a horrific chemical weapon death threat that the whole shul, we had to spend so much money on security for that night. And why were we doing this event? The whole event was for Israel. We had 1,000 people pack our shul to your Ambassador David Friedman and Ben Shapiro, and we recognized our congressman. He couldn't be there that night, a Democrat, my beloved friend Ted Deutsch. We had words from Governor DeSantis and from Senator Scott. It was an amazing night for Israel, amazing night for Israel. Nothing religious about it. And Mario Bramnick is absolutely not a missionary. And the Latino Coalition for Israel has done more, is still until today advocating for Abraham Accords in other countries, is pushing South American countries to move their embassies to Jerusalem. They are working and fighting so hard for Israel and the Jewish people. It's shocking they haven't given up that work because of the way they were treated. But we partnered with them, again, under the guidance of Gedolei Yisrael. They were great, great rabbis who absolutely
Sheffer, I believe, gave you haskama. He gave you approbation for it. And
Sheffer's two sons came to the event to show support, actually came. And there was nothing religious. There was nothing proselytizing. There was nothing missionizing about it whatsoever. What's ironic about it, again, for whatever reason, these people are decided to make me enemy number one and to try to gain popularity, because as I said before, you're rewarded for being outrageous. So if you make video after video after video where you call someone a mamzer and deserving of death and describe them as being a missionary and you say outrageous things, you can get a lot of followers. You're going to try to build your own persona or brand in that way. Certainly not the way I would ever want to build my brand. But it was based on lies and falsehoods. There was nothing true about it. And we ended up with an extraordinary event, and an event that we advocated and continue to advocate for Israel. And Israel itself was very grateful that we held that event. So there was nothing religious, no missionizing, no proselytizing, simply cooperating. And the irony is that the Jewish community is regularly partnering with the Christians and evangelicals.
Absolutely.
In New York,
they gave a lot of money to Orthodox Jewish organizations. I know some of them. In fact, Rabbi Americana was the first person to really go after the evangelicals to get money for them. I don't know if you're aware of that, but people.
Yeah. Pastor Hagee, the evangelicals have given money to Rabbi Grossman, the disco rabbi, Migdal Or, Migdal Emek. The evangelicals just last year, a couple of years ago, they made a big donation to the Sans Kloisenberg Hospital with the Rebbe's permission, Haskama. These
Laniado Hospital, right?
Laniado Hospital, great life-saving tools were purchased in the hospital from evangelicals. Or how about the fact that a Aguda of New York works with the church when it came to Corona and the ability to reopen private and parochial schools?
They work on a regular basis. I spoke to Rabbi Moshe Scherer of blessed memory, who used to meet regularly with Cardinal O'Connor. They used to have breakfast meetings on a regular basis. It was confirmed for me, both by Cardinal O'Connor and by members of the Agudas. So you need to have relationships. You need to work with groups, and especially in New York, where you have problems with education and the state and the New York State Department of Education getting involved in curriculums that affects Jews and non-Jews, tuition tax relief. There are lots of issues that we're working together with. So people may not be aware of it, but it exists.
Yeah, it was a manufactured controversy because, again, it only benefits the people putting out the fake news. So it was totally manufactured.
One moment left. You said you would do things differently with that event. What would you have done differently in retrospect?
Yeah, the one thing I would have done differently is not do it the Boca Raton Synagogue together with the Latino Coalition for Israel. I would have joined with other shuls in South Florida. I would have made a much bigger, broader night for Israel. Latino Coalition for Israel would be one. But that way, all the focus and emphasis would not just be on me and our shul. Those who would gun for and hate what we were doing, let them take on all of us. We didn't do it alone now either. We did it with Simon Wiesenthal Center, was a co-sponsor. Rabbi Adlerstein, who is an expert in this area, actually heads up the interfaith work of the Wiesenthal Center, was a partner and a big supporter in the event. But that's really the only thing I would have done differently. I won't regret working with the evangelicals. If we have to rely on the Jews for Israel, we're in big trouble.
But they're the biggest supporters of it. And by the way, that's changing. The younger generation of evangelicals are not supportive of Israel, unfortunately.
Yeah.
We have to work about that too. We need a birthright for Christians as well to go to Israel.
Yep.
Pastor Mario Brownnick, what was his reaction to all the brouhaha, the controversy? Did you speak to him about it? Because I'm sure he was aware of what was going on.
Yeah, I did. He was very shaken by it. He was very shaken by it. He was very deeply disturbed by it. He, at his own expense, hired private security for several weeks because of the threats that were going around. And it was deeply disturbing. And as I said, we're lucky that he hasn't stopped his work for Israel. He flies around South American countries regularly, and he represents an enormous, I believe, millions of Latinos for Israel. And when he comes into a political office and he advocates for moving the embassy to Jerusalem, it carries weight. And it's a miracle that he hasn't abandoned all this work because of the focus and the lies that were spread about him. Grateful for his work and the work of others. And again, we're not proselytizing. We fight missionaries. We have to stand up to missionaries, but you have to be nuanced and you have to be educated. People are not educated, especially if you're on the internet. People on social media, on the internet, just because somebody sent you a link or you watched a YouTube video or they WhatsApped you something, doesn't mean it's true. Be thoughtful, be smart, be judicious in what you read and what you listen to and what you watch. Know where it's coming from, and know the people that they're speaking about, and ask yourself, does that sound like the rabbi I know? Does that sound like the community I know? Would they be in the business of converting their entire community to Christianity? Does that make any sense whatsoever? So we have to be judicious and educated consumers of information. There'll always be bad characters. There'll always be bad characters spreading lies and misinformation. It puts even greater responsibility on us to be careful in how we access information.
Rabbi Efrem Goldberg, senior rabbi at Boca Raton Synagogue. He's a well-sought-out leader, one of the top Jewish rabbis in the United States, and he has a very popular podcast. So what is the name of the podcast, Rabbi Goldberg?
Podcast called Behind the Bima, an opportunity to hear from a little bit these kinds of discussions in the rabbinate. What's life like as a rabbi, rabbi's children? What are the decisions we make? How do we go about the policies that we do? Different holidays that come up, how do we prepare? And the highlight is every episode, every week, we interview another major personality, Jewish, non-Jewish, religious, non-religious, from whom we can learn and gain. And we've had really diverse, over 80 incredible leaders, men and women. And we'd love if you checked it out, Behind the Bima.
Recommend it. And I apologize, we never had you on before. This is the first, but not the last time. I got to have you back. Nice to hear a voice, not afraid to speak out. Kolakavod, keep on speaking out.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real honor, and I really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks for listening.
For continuous Jewish programs, talklinenetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the talklinenetwork.com. Past shows you can find